Some sad news to pass along tonight. Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has died. The Carter Center announcing today his passing after spending more than a year in hospice care. Thanks for joining us on this WUSA 9 special report streaming right now on WUSA 9 Plus. I'm Larry Miller. Jimmy Carter, 100 years old, passed away today in his home of Plains, Georgia. Originally from Plains, Georgia as well. Born October 1st, 1924. He was the 39th president of the United States from 1977 to 1981. During his presidency, so much was accomplished, including the creation of the U.S. Department of Energy and the Department of Education as well, which were established during his time in office for 4 years, where he was then beat by then President Reagan. A lot of reaction continuing to pour in tonight. We will get to that, but we want to take you back to 2015 at the age of 90 when Jimmy Carter took place in a CBS series called Note to Self. It's here where he wrote a letter to his 12-year-old self. This letter was written just a month before he revealed to the world they had melanoma.
I'm writing to a 12-year-old Jimmy Carter, although I am now 90. As you now live and work on a farm in South Georgia and have just reached your highest goal of learning how to plow a field with 2 mules, I hope you will not limit the other ambitions of your life. Your mother, a registered nurse, is ignoring the strict segregation that hurts your playmates and friends, all of whom are African American. Remember, as you grow older, that this racial discrimination is a blight on both white and black people. I know your top ambition is to go to the U.S. Naval Academy and someday serve as a submarine officer. You must always do your best and use this experience to learn about the world we live in and how a strong nation can be a champion of peace. You will see how President Harry Truman's order as Commander-in-Chief to abolish all racial discrimination in the military service will bring welcome changes, but it always will need to be improved. When you return from the Navy, you must use your years as a farmer to expand your heart and mind as much as your father did, as preparation for the public service that is to come.
My name is Jimmy Carter, and I'm running for president.
In private life and in elective office,
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
you should remember the advice that you got from your school teacher, Miss Judy Coleman.
As my high school teacher, Miss Judy Coleman, used to say, we must
accommodate changing times.
and still hold to unchanging principles.
These principles will best be expressed in our religious faith, but even more clearly and briefly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which will be written after a terrible war. Miss Judy's words will be good advice, no matter how many challenges and disappointments you have to face.
174th day of the Iran crisis has brought a startling and tragic turn of events.
It was my decision to attempt the rescue operation.
The gasoline problem is worse than ever in many parts of the country.
Runaway interest rates are one symptom of the inflation.
After every setback, I hope you will re-examine the causes of your failure, reassess your own talents and abilities, and then set even higher goals whenever possible.
The cheers and whistles rolled over Jimmy Carter for bringing the 2 old enemies together.
Let history record that deep and ancient antagonism can be settled without bloodshed.
In Oslo, Norway today, former President Jimmy Carter accepted the Nobel Peace Prize.
One of your greatest sources of happiness will be your wife, Rosalind, and the growing family that will be coming. Stay close to all of them. Bring them together whenever possible, and provide them the same help and support that your own parents gave to you. You will get to know some great people. Some of them will be quite famous, and others will be known just to their own neighbors. Form as close a friendship with them as possible, and learn from their example. You will face challenges and opportunities throughout your life, but don't worry. So many people will want to help you along the way.
Jimmy Carter had an incredibly active life after leaving the White House, writing more than 32 books, touching on issues from politics to international issues, even talking about his family and the impact that they've had on his life. He also won 3 Grammys for Best Spoken Word Album, and the most recent was in 2019 for his book, Faith, A Journey for All. Now, we are getting some statements now from a number of different organizations, including the Friends of the National World War II Memorial, who say, in part, its director of the board saying this, that President Jimmy Carter's life after the White House was incredibly active and revered by leaders and citizens across the country. He fought diseases, built houses for the poor, and tirelessly advocated basic human rights. It goes on to say that we will miss his resolve to bring democracy across the globe in these particularly trying times. So that's just some of what we're hearing as reaction continues to pour in. Let's bring in Rafael Sanchez-Cruz right now, who's joining me on the desk. You've been scouring the interwebs there as people have been responding to the news. This news just breaking within the last 30 to 45 minutes, and already we're getting some statements from some elected leaders.
Yeah, Larry, and we are waiting, obviously, the statement from the White House and President Biden. You know, obviously, people expect him to come forward, and then obviously a president's afterwards. But, you know, I'm reading from Georgia politician Stacey Abrams, who also is a fierce advocate for voting rights, just stating, you know, about Jimmy Carter's life after the presidency, right? His role, obviously, in the Oval Office, but also all the work that he's done. She says, in part, Jimmy Carter built homes, saved lives, and tended to souls. God bless President Carter. May the family he and Mrs. Carter raised know only comfort in these days of grief. But I also want to mention a statement that came out just a couple minutes ago from one of our local politicians, Virginia Senator Mark Warner. I want to show that on the screen there. So he says, Jimmy Carter blazed a trail from the peanut fields of Plains, Georgia, to the Navy, to the governor's mansion, the White House, and to a remarkable post-presidential career, modeling leadership, philanthropy, and love of country. Every step of the way, we lost a giant. Jimmy Carter gave me my first job out of law school, and I have deeply admired his service since leaving the Oval Office. His dedication to building homes through Habitat for Humanity has always brought back warm memories of my father, who also volunteered with the organization well into his 80s. Like much of the greatest generation, President Carter will be remembered by what he built and left behind for us, a model of service late into life, a tireless devotion to family and philanthropy, and a more peaceful world to call home, end quote. And Larry, we were just talking about some of the homes that President Carter built in Southeast DC. Right. So a lot of that impact we're seeing here in the district and across the DMV region. I'm sure we're going to get more and more reactions from, you know, politicians, those who knew him and those who don't, but are remembering his legacy, you know, 100 years and what a life he lived. Well,
from Georgia, but had an impact not only on the nation, but the world. Was a volunteer with Habitat Humanity for 35 years. And we think about how even folks here have been able to benefit from his philanthropy, from his volunteerism, certainly just demonstrating the impact that he's had. So, Rafael, thank you for that. Well, no doubt, it's hard to overstate the political legacy of President Jimmy Carter, but Carter always said that his favorite title wasn't just president, it was also husband as well. As Lorenzo Hall reports, their 77-year marriage was nothing short of a true love story.
I don't know if we want to be remembered as the most prolific inhabitants of the White House or not, but I think we are holding our own there.
With persistence, patience, and passion, these two built an unbreakable bond. Jimmy and Rosalind Carter began laying the foundation for their journey together in Plains, Georgia, a small farming town where they were born and raised on the same street.
I want to be remembered as a good husband for Rosalind, and also...
They started dating in 1945 when Mr. Carter, then a midshipman at the U.S. Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, needed a date when he was home. His younger sister, Ruth, set him up with a friend, 18-year-old Eleanor Rosalind Smith, whom Mr. Carter was already eyeing. Coincidentally, Mrs. Carter also had a secret crush on 21-year-old Carter after noticing his photos in military uniform at the Carter family home. Following their first date, Mr. Carter told his mother he met his future wife. He was right. They married shortly after his graduation in 1946, and after Rosalind turned down his earlier proposals twice.
When I was growing up, I didn't think I would ever get married. And then along came Jimmy Carter, and my life's been an adventure ever since. Thank you. I love you.
That adventure includes 4 children, the Georgia governor's mansion, and the campaign trail for president. President Carter called Mrs. Carter his secret weapon.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
I, Jimmy Carter, do solemnly swear.
In the White House, the two worked together, focused on human rights, global peace efforts, and mental health awareness.
I think the favorite thing we had was a family life that we had in the White House.
The former president says of his 4 years in the White House, the best part was bonding with his loved ones.
We had Amy there, who was 7 years old when we got there, and 9 years old when we got there, and she was 3 years old when I became governor. And we had two of our sons and their wives and family there. We had a grandson born the first month we were in the White House. And so we had a good family life in the White House.
Carter lost his bid for re-election in 1980. That devastated the couple, so they returned to a place where they could find peace, Plains, Georgia. With the framework of their lives securely fastened, the Carters grew closer, bonding in service. They constructed hundreds of homes and the Carter Center, a human rights nonprofit, working tirelessly, even through Mr. Carter's cancer diagnosis.
What's going to be next? Well, one thing I know, it'll be something, because Jimmy Carter's miserable if he's not doing something.
Mr. Carter described their marriage as a full partnership.
The best thing that ever happened to me was marrying Rosalind.
A lasting legacy of love they built together, one for the history books. Hometown sweethearts turned the longest married presidential couple.
To my wife, Rosalind, I want to express a particular gratitude for being the right woman that I chose for my wife.
Well, Rosalind Carter will go on to transition in 2023. And that was Lorenzo Hall reporting with that story. Well, President Carter was also a man of strong faith, and fewer things gave him joy than sharing that faith. And as Suzanne Lawler from our Georgia sister station, WMAZ, shows us, thousands of people flocked to Plains, Georgia over the years to hear the former president lead Sunday school classes.
My dad was a superintendent of the school system, and Mr. Jimmy was very active in the school system about integration.
Jan Williams says she knew President Jimmy Carter since she was 5 years old. Later on in life, she interacted with him a lot at Maranatha Baptist Church.
He is still with us through the Holy Spirit.
That's where Carter taught Sunday school classes almost every Sunday morning.
I truly can say that when Jimmy Carter says, "I'm going to pray for you," he means that. And that he not only talks about what it's like to be a Christian, but he shows what it's like to be a Christian.
Thousands of people made the trip to Plains to hear Carter, and the small congregation would swell from 30 people to 300 folks. That's the capacity of the church. In fact, people would camp out the night before in this parking lot just to get a seat.
Everybody wants to feel his presence, and those who sit on the front row are sitting within 6 feet of him, you know.
Besides scripture, Carter's message on those Sabbath days was simple: be kind to one another.
He's so cute because he'll say, if you can bake a cake, cut it in half. Keep half for yourself, that's okay. But then take the other half to somebody else and bless them.
Carter carved the collection plates himself and donated them to the church. Jan says they knew this day would come, a time when Carter will no longer occupy his white swivel chair in front of the altar.
We do know that when his last service will be here at Maranatha. We do know that it will be a lot of people who will wish they were in this church, but it will be only a Pacific number.
Folks won't get into that final service, but many will have memories of how President Carter spiritually touched their lives.
All right. So we know that not only did the former president not only was he a man of faith, but really the idea of faith was something that permeated every aspect of his life, particularly in the aspect of his volunteerism as well. Now, during their time in Washington, the Carters attended First Baptist Church at 16th and O Street in Northwest D.C. Mrs. Carter said that they picked this church because it was the preference of some of the family's children as well. Rafael Sanchez Cruz joining us back on the desk right now, and we are getting now some additional reaction, at least from the top members of the administration. Typically, it takes some time for the White House, the president, to respond, and then from there we see other dignitaries, and it looks like we have finally heard from the president.
Yeah, President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden issuing their statement, and it's a very long statement, and I just want to say, it starts off saying, today America and the world lost an extraordinary leader, statesman, and humanitarian. It then goes on to describe more of Jimmy Carter's legacy. This is a couple who knew both Jimmy Carter and his wife for a very long time, but something that really stuck out to me, it says, quote, "And to all young people in this nation, and for anyone in search of what it means to live a life of purpose and meaning, the good life, study Jimmy Carter, a man of principle, faith, and humility. He showed that we are a great nation because we are good people, decent and honorable, courageous, compassionate, humble, and strong." Larry, I was just reading some of those quotes that you reflect on after, such a significant passing, and you see a lot of these messages resonate with former President Jimmy Carter. That unity, that call for unity in our country, and maybe a message that still resonates now as we're dealing with this transition from the Biden administration to President-elect Trump's administration. Just those messages of someone who was deserving of being a Nobel Peace Prize winner, So a lot of what we talk about is that life that he lived after the White House, and it's just extraordinary. So it's a very lengthy statement that President Joe Biden and First Lady Jill Biden issued, and we're seeing more. U.S. Senator Ben Cardin, he says, in part, "When I was a young state legislator in Annapolis, Jimmy Carter was coming on the national scene. He was a model to me that you can be honest and straightforward with the American people, and you could accomplish a great deal. He represented the very best values that you want in elected officials." And he goes on to talk about his humility as a leader, which of course is something that's still resonating with people to this day. Well, and that's something that's continuously been reflected not only in his life, but also his post-presidency, right? This idea of service, this idea of volunteerism, giving back to people, not only doing that from the White House, but also being able to do that in the neighborhood as well, teaching Sunday school classes, participating for 35 years in Habitat for Humanity, even when he was ill, right? Those things certainly speak to his character, what his contributions, and his love for people generally. And I think a lot of the comments that we've read thus far, that's certainly been reflected, that this idea of giving back and providing support and being there for people, but having this belief in community is something that's driven him and his family for all of these years. And a person who lives so many lives. I mean, we talk about, obviously his political life, but just all his, the help and dedication to community, and just, his life in Georgia. It's just remarkable. I think that we would be just lucky to live 10% of what he did. And I think that's what's resonating with people as these reactions keep trickling in. All right, we'll come back to you in a second. In the meantime, looking back on the life of former President Jimmy Carter, in early 2015, President Carter was diagnosed with a melanoma tumor on his liver. Then in August, he announced that the melanoma had then spread to his brain. By December 2015, after receiving radiation treatment for the melanoma in his brain, President Carter announced that he was officially cancer-free. He made the announcement at his home church in Plains, Georgia, and he told the Sunday school class there that he was teaching that he put himself in the hands of God.
When I went this week, they didn't find any cancer at all, so I have good news. So a lot of people prayed for me, and I appreciate that.
As we all know, that prayer changes things. Part of Jimmy Carter's legacy also lies in Annapolis. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy. Our Jess Arnold spoke with those who knew him at the academy.
Yearbook pages full of alumni who etched their way into the country's history.
Miller, McKinney, Flanagan.
And former President Jimmy Carter.
There were a number of people who were very close friends with Jimmy Carter. A lot of them worked on his administration, and so a very cohesive class.
Eileen Marusic serves as secretary for the class of 47, collecting and documenting the stories of the men she calls her 47 heart. She took over after her father, Larry Marusic, who also graduated then, passed away.
The best part about taking this was that I was able to channel my dad because they lived the same military experience he lived. And as I see them passing away, it's been joyful, but it's sad.
The ones left living, all at least in their late 90s. Some still remember the midshipman who would go on to be the 39th president of the United States, like class president Jack Stevens, who was in the same cutter crew as Jimmy Carter. A cutter's a type of boat.
And people ask, well, how was he? Well, he was absolutely non-demanding. Of course, he hadn't been president at that time either, but he was easy to get along with, a neat wife.
Joe Flanagan, who wrestled at the academy and served in the Navy for years, remembers taking classes with Jimmy Carter.
He was always a straight shooter, and I enjoyed his company. A lot smarter than I was in math and the sciences, but I was way ahead of him in English and literature.
He also worked on Carter's presidential campaign, as did Bob McKinney, who didn't get to know the future president and his wife Rosalind until after graduation. Jimmy Carter asked him to serve as chairman of the Federal Home Loan Bank Board when he was elected president.
They're wonderful people.
McKinney and his wife even traveled with the Carters to China.
He wore the hell out of you. He was a very active guy. He swam every morning, so that's what kept him healthy. And he gave 3 talks a day while he was over there. And he wore me out just following him around.
From sea to presidency, Academy alums have long been Carter's crewmates.
I feel like it's been an honor to know these men.
An honor to share these pages with each other and Jimmy Carter. Jess Arnold, WUSA 9.
Jess, thank you for that story. Joining us right now is Dr. Barbara Perry, the Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center, where she co-directs the Presidential Oral History Program. Dr. Perry, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you.
I want to get your initial reaction to the news today that former President Jimmy Carter has died.
I have to say that my first reaction is one of sadness, because his election in 1976, that was the first presidential election that I was eligible to vote in, and I cast my first presidential vote for him. I had seen him in 1975 here in my hometown of Louisville, Kentucky. They had a mini convention for the Democrats, and he was one of 9 members of the Democratic Party, all of whom were far better known than he throughout the country and the world. And I remember being really impressed with him, but thinking, how in the world would he get the nomination? But he did, and he will always be known for that, coming from seemingly nowhere in 1976 to get the Democratic nomination for president. And then I decided one of my bucket list items long ago was to go to a presidential inauguration. So I took the train from Cincinnati, Ohio to Washington. It was freezing cold. It was so cold the Potomac River froze over. But I stood in the back of the Capitol and watched him being sworn in. And then I watched him and Rosalind walk down Pennsylvania Avenue. And that was a different approach that they took. It was their populist man and woman of the people approach. So I will always think of him as a man of the people.
When you think about his time in the White House, what should people be reflecting on? What should we take away?
The first thing that we should reflect on and take away, and this will be part of his legacy forever, is that he righted the ship of state after the Watergate scandal and the unprecedented resignation of a president, Richard Nixon, caught up in that scandal. And in part because Gerald Ford, who replaced Nixon as vice president in 1974, because Ford pardoned Nixon, that probably helped lead to the narrow election of Jimmy Carter. But what people should think about that is that he was transparent. He said he would never lie to the American people, and he didn't. He was not a man of Washington, which meant that people were in favor of him because they didn't think he would be tainted with the scandals of Washington. But as it turned out, on the other side of the ledger, that was also in part his downfall. He didn't really understand how Washington operated, and it took him too long to get up to speed on that. combined with runaway inflation at that time, which was almost twice as much as it was recently when everyone was complaining. That meant that mortgage rates were in the 15-16% range. And then the taking of the Americans by the storming of the Iranian students, the radicals in Tehran, the taking of our some 50 plus hostages from the American embassy. Only in the last moments of the Carter administration, after he had been soundly defeated in a landslide by Ronald Reagan in 1980, was Jimmy Carter able to get those hostages released. So those were the negatives that caused him to lose. But as you've been pointing out, many people would say, sometimes only half tongue in cheek, he's the best ex-president we've ever had.
And speaking of what he's been able to accomplish out of office, I mean, he has had quite an active schedule, even as he continued to age, and even when he was ill, he was still volunteering. When you think about the impact that he's had from that perspective, I'd imagine that there's a lot for us to take away from regarding his service, but also a sort of a model about what former presidents should be doing once they leave office as well.
Yes. And in fact, he created that model. So not only do we look back and say, what a great post-presidency, but he's one of many modern presidents who came into the office at a pretty young age and therefore left office at still a fairly young age. So the Carter Center, not simply to be a presidential library, which as a scholar of the presidency, I love presidential archives, but he didn't want it to be a passive library, which is why they also call it the Carter Center, because it became a hub for his work and Mrs. Carter's work around the world, monitoring elections, getting rid of terrible diseases in the developing world, and Habitat for Humanity, building homes for the impoverished around the world, and working on her mental health issues. So all of that was based at the Carter Library and then spread throughout the world.
All right. So much for us to take away from this conversation. Dr. Barbara Perry, the Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Thank you so much for your time this evening. We appreciate you.
Thank you for having me.
A Navy ensign, a governor, a president, Jimmy Carter lived a life of service, but he grew up at a time when the law of the land was ruled by separate and unequal. And as Marcella Robertson reports, throughout his political career, Carter crossed that racial divide and cracked the door open to create a more inclusive America.
My young life shaped by those I loved.
And a segregated society. That was Jimmy Carter's boyhood. He wrote about it in his book of poetry, Always a Reckoning.
Jimmy Carter had grown up with African-American playmates, for example. His mother, who was a nurse, delivered African-American babies.
Her brown skin fixed her in our segregated world, yet Rachel had an aura of a queen.
Rachel Clark is the woman Carter vividly writes about in his prose. She lived and worked on his parents' peanut farm in rural Plains, Georgia. It was Rachel, a black woman, who shaped the person the 39th president became. And according to the University of Virginia's Miller Center, when it comes to civil rights, Carter's legacy is layered. Not known for passing groundbreaking legislation, but rather it's more symbolic in how he pushed civil rights forward.
He really carries that through. He makes good on that promise as governor of Georgia, bringing blacks particularly into high positions of government.
As president, Jimmy Carter took similar actions.
And he developed this affirmative action program to get more minorities, people of color, and women on the federal judiciary, and he was successful at that.
He also exposed the world to a more diverse United States, appointing African Americans to prominent positions in his administration. Andrew Young as UN Ambassador, Patricia Roberts Harris as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, and the Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare.
Not all was a bed of roses when it came to Jimmy Carter and civil rights. For example, coming up to his run for the presidency, Jimmy Carter actually opposed busing for school integration purposes. I think he genuinely thought it was not the best policy, but he also knew that that would appeal to white voters.
Before being elected to office, some might say Carter was silent on civil rights issues. But historians say in order to be a viable candidate in the South, he had to tread lightly.
Oftentimes, Jimmy Carter, more by his actions than his words, I think should be put into the category of a civil rights champion.
Once he left the Oval Office, he did not stop championing those causes. He and his wife, Rosalind, partnered with Habitat for Humanity to hammer the cause of affordable housing. And together they traveled the world to blitz build single-family homes. In June 1992, Carter came to Washington, D.C. to help volunteers and 10 families saw, hammer, and raise their own houses on Benning Road Southeast.
You know, we spent a lot on weapons, we cut back on housing, we spent a lot on weapons, we cut back on health care. And I think this is it's not a charity. When you give a person good health and a decent place to live, it's a sound investment for our country.
It's an investment Jimmy Carter continued to make in service to his country in more ways than one to move civil rights for all forward. Marcella Robertson, WUSA 9.
Once again, former President Jimmy Carter passes away at the age of 100 in his home of Plains, Georgia. We did get a statement right now from former President Clinton, and as well as the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, saying in part that Hillary and I mourn the passing of President Jimmy Carter and give thanks for his long, good life. Guided by his faith, President Carter lived to serve others until the very end. The 39th president was the longest lived amongst those who served in the Oval Office. We'll have much more on the former president's passing coming up on the news at 6:30. I'm Larry Miller.